everyone. Good morning and welcome to BGF's webinar on building strong boards and effective governance. I'm Roshni Bandesha. I'm the head of ESG and sustainability at BGF. And today I'm being joined by two experts within these topics who I'll hand over to within a second. The reason why we're having this particular topic as a conversation point for us is because if we look through the BGF portfolio across the 200 companies, I think the single most common thing that you'll see is that we all want to be building effective governance. We all want to be building boards that work very well to drive value for all the stakeholders. However, putting it into practice is quite challenging because the definition of value, the definition of effectiveness boards could be very different depending on which sector, industry, or just the kind of individuals you have across the board. So then we at BGF thought, why don't we break it down? Why don't we actually bring in people who've looked into this from a multifaceted way to help our CEOs, our chairs, and our management teams to think about how do you analytically analyze whether you have an effective board, whether you have an effective governance, and what can you actually do about it? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the two speakers that we have joining us today. Perhaps starting with you, Sarah, would be lovely to get an introduction from you.
Thanks very much, Roshni. Thanks. And hi, everybody. Really nice to see you. To sort of see you. We can only see each other, but I gather that there are lots of you out there and several of you with whom I've already worked. So lovely to see you again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Parker and I'm a partner at an organisation called BoardClic. And we'll tell you about BoardClic as we go through the morning. But we are very proud and pleased to be a partner with BGF, and we have been working with you as an organisation to help the boards that you have invested in to grow and create value for the company. We are we are born out of a board advisory practice firm that was originally founded in Stockholm about 15 years ago, but has since developed into a digital and data-led platform to give power to boards, chairs, and investor teams to help to analyse and understand and benchmark their effectiveness of their boards, and critically to see what immediate actions they can take to make their board more effective. So as I say, we have a partnership with BGF. Delighted to be with you this morning, and I will tell you more about it as we go through the webinar.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for joining us today. Kate, over to you.
Hi, morning. Thanks, Roshni. Hello, everyone. As Sarah said, I'm sure there's plenty of people in the audience today who already know me and I've worked with, so welcome. And to those I don't know, it's a real pleasure to have you here. I'm Kate. I am Head of Talent Network for BGF. I joined BGF 10 years ago and have been part of building our network and really matchmaking the board directors in that network to our businesses as we invest and through the life of our involvement with our portfolio, which I have to say is an absolute pleasure. Obviously, along the way, building boards, we talk a lot about effectiveness at the time that we're putting that board together, and then as it continues to grow and scale with the portfolio. And so my role is to look across all 300 something companies and think about have we got the right constituents in place for those strategies. So it's a real pleasure to talk to you about this topic today.
Thank you, Kate. And to all the attendees, thank you for joining us today morning. If you have any questions, please do send them through. I'll make sure that we do get time during the conversation for both our experts to speak about that. So without further ado, jumping into the actual conversation, and maybe Kate, I'd love to start with you, given your tenure of experience of working with the boards within sort of BGF. Could you help us understand why has board effectiveness or strong governance really mattered to BGF so much? I know there's a lot of effort and a lot of focus that has gone over the last 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if we start with strong boards, for me, having a strong board that's really fully aligned with absolute clarity of the business's goals and ambitions is really important. It's important for any investor-backed business. It's particularly important for a minority investor whose house style is to build relationships with management teams, making sure that we are communicating effectively, ensuring alignment, understanding each other's goals, and really making sure that that's aligned to the ambition of the business so that we're driving for success. getting the right set of people who are really aligned and communicating very effectively, one, it enhances performance and sends a great message to the rest of the organisation outside of the board. The board is taking its leadership seriously, and it also hugely mitigates risk. The board asking itself the right questions at the right time means that small issues don't become big issues. We deal with them quickly. So that's why it really matters to BGF, and that's across all our businesses, whether that's an earlier stage venture business, whether that's a slightly more mature growth cap business, and particularly in our quoted businesses where we're working with multiple other shareholders. So I do think that when we use the term governance, the connotations can often be something that's quite dry, it's inflexible. A lot of CEOs will say to me, do I really have time to be worrying about governance? Is that the most important thing? And I would say, yes, there is an element of due process, ensuring that we make the board sustainable and that we protect the business and that people around the board are really worrying about that. And it's about ensuring that the leadership of the business are stretched and they're really constructively challenged. So for me, governance is always a lot more interesting than that slightly dry, have we got the right risk register in place?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. So you raised something interesting about within the BGF portfolio. We obviously have early stage, medium growth, then we also have quoted. Have you, in your experience, seen that there's some balance or some sort of sweet spot that works across all, or is it really focused on which industry or stage you're in?
So that is such an interesting question. And actually, I think it is very specific to each business. Mm-hmm. There are themes around sectors. There are definitely themes around stages of development and also shareholder constituents. And you can use those themes to help get you to some of the answers more quickly. But actually, every board is unique. It's a unique set of individuals who've come together to take advantage of a market opportunity. I think if we talk about themes, very clearly, when we're talking to those earlier stage businesses, perhaps they've got multiple investor directors on their board, and then the alignment part of the conversation is absolutely critical, continually making sure that all of those voting directors, shareholder directors on the board are aligned around value creation plan for the business. I think with the growth capital businesses, it's often more that we're building a board for the first time and we're testing a new board with our board effectiveness reviews. So making sure that we got it right and it continues to be right. And also with new relationships, making space to talk about, are they optimal? Not are they good or bad?
Yeah.
Are they absolutely optimal and are they helping drive performance? And obviously quite different in the quoted boards where by the time we invest, there's a full PLC board with multiple independent directors, still looking at alignment and value. And no matter which board situation you're looking at, the overriding theme is this a group of people who communicate really effectively, whose challenge is really valuable to the leadership team and are really passionate about what the business is doing?
Yeah. So you can actually start seeing that these are the conversations that are going to hopefully lead to better decision making, but it's still quite a challenging task by itself. So maybe, Sarah, bringing you in over here, you've obviously looked at small to medium-sized businesses across not just BGF, but other businesses as well and other investors. Perhaps you could share with us why is it such a hurdle to be thinking through building effectiveness boards and having strong governance? Like, what are some of the key hurdles that companies or individuals have to cross over in order to just start their journey in certain ways?
Yes, and I think a lot of this picks up on some of the ideas that Kate was alluding to in her previous answers. I think there's often a sort of perception and a mindset hurdle. So when people talk about governance, they think of it as a sort of legal compliance issue. And it's a sort of, this is something that we have to do to tick the box to say that we're doing these things. Then we can get that out of the way and we can get on with the actual business of running our business and growing and creating value. And it is trying to, help address that perception, but also to genuinely make board effectiveness a value driver, because it is true that there are some processes that are just tick the box legal compliance and they're not value adding. So it is about trying to address perception, but also to make the process valuable in itself as a way of creating value in the business. Because particularly once you get to the point where you have an external, be it a chair or independent NEDs, these are people who don't necessarily spend a lot of time together in the way that an operational team would. So there's an awful lot of assumptions that can be made. People may not know where people are coming from on different issues, and they may not have had conversations as explicitly as they perhaps think they have. And trying to get all of those people on the same page and all of those people acting like they are a team to grow this business is really the key. That's the most important thing. But I think when companies are and management teams are starting on this journey, I think there are questions around, well, what do we actually even do? What are the right questions to ask? How do we even understand what makes an effective board? What should we be asking? Okay, so even if we ask the questions, how do we know whether what we are doing is good? How do we judge the outcome? And then how do we actually come up with actions on any of this? I think there is also a bit of a fear of what comes out of it. And we all know as human beings, we don't like difficult conversations. And I think people are sometimes worried that this is going to lead to conversations they don't necessarily want to have around dynamics, perhaps around the board table. So I think there's a little bit of a fear sometimes of that as well. But those are some of the hurdles that we come across when we're talking to boards who either haven't done this before, or certainly don't engage in this with an idea that it can actually be helpful for them. They sort of see it as a necessary evil and try and do it as infrequently as possible. So when we're talking to people who've got that idea, those are some of the things they're worried about.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, I would echo all of those points from Sarah, and we hear that in the BGF portfolio, and quite specifically, we'll hear a couple of things that Sarah said. Time, how long is this going to take?
Yeah,
we don't have time. Expense also, because fast growing businesses running lean, trying to be as efficient as possible. How expensive is this going to be? It is often a concern and something we've clearly worked very hard to try and mitigate, which we'll come on to. But in terms of the time point, it links to a broader leadership question, which I think Sarah would agree with, is often CEOs of scaling up companies don't recognize investing in themselves as a critical value driver. For founder CEOs, as your company is being magnificently successful, your role as a CEO is getting bigger, your pressure as a leader is getting bigger. So to me, board effectiveness, investing the time, particularly in making sure the board is effective, and investing in the CEO, understanding the leadership of the business is of critical importance.
I would completely agree with that. And I think that's where the role of a chair can be super helpful, because a CEO can often, exactly like Kate says, feel that they don't have time, but also feel that it can be quite self-indulgent to invest in themselves in this way, which of course it isn't, because it's adding so much value for the business. But to actually have a chair, an independent chair, say, no, we need to invest in the board and in the CEO and in the management team, I think can be a really helpful way of sort of making that feel like a safer, more constructive conversation.
Oh, thank you. So it almost seems like it starts from not knowing what we don't know, being worried about it, having assumptions. And then once you start understanding, then sort of, maybe thinking about, okay, is it going to cost too much? What is the value of it? So there's always this perception of what you want to be achieving versus is this really value additive? But then at the end of the day, I think that's where a lot of the business and the market is moving towards. And that's one of the things that BoardClic came into existence, I believe, to solve for as well. So maybe, Sarah, speaking about BoardClic specifically, so how did this come to life in your mind? And how do you think this tool is helping companies to solve some of these assumption-based challenges to actual practical realities that we've talked about?
Thanks, Roshni. Yes, so we started with exactly what you and Kate have outlined as the sort of environment and context. We were ourselves a board advisory firm going into organisations doing board effectiveness reviews. But there were a few key thoughts that we were playing around in our mind and were becoming apparent to us as we were going around doing this work. The first is that it is to do a full externally facilitated board evaluation where you bring in external consultants, they spend time, they observe board meetings, they interview everybody, they go around, write reports, write up recommendations. That is a time-consuming process. And it is an expensive process. And I think boards have a huge amount of fear of, if we even open this door, how much is the end bill for all this going to be? So it was the practice, which is, as we've talked about, we believe is a real fundamental value driver for a business, was being restricted to a limited number of companies that could afford the time or the money or had some external corporate governance compliance code requiring them to do it. So it was a value driver that we thought was really important, but was being unnecessarily restricted to a small group of organizations by the way it was being conducted. We wanted to change that. We also thought that there was a real opportunity to bring some data to this world, because it was a world that wasn't very technology enabled and it wasn't data led. And we had been gathering over 15 years huge amounts of data. So what we did to try to change this and disrupt a little bit, in 2018, we launched BoardClic, which is the organization that BGF knows today, which is a digital platform where we have taken 15 years of expertise in corporate governance content. So going back to those, what do I even ask? What are the right questions? What are the right issues? We've put all that into a platform. So you don't have to worry about the content. The content is there. It's very robust and it's tailored to specific types of situations. So we have a template, for example, for BGF companies that we have worked with Kate and her team. So you don't need to think, well, am I going to be doing a review that's actually aimed at a FTSE 100 listed bank here? No, we've tailored formats specifically for different audiences and different organization types. So you don't have to worry about the content. We've done that piece. It's very easy to use, so it's not time consuming. You don't need to worry about that piece. It's technology enabled and it's a digital platform, so it's very affordable. So you don't need to worry about that piece. And then the way we've tried to bring data to it is to give you a view from the outside in. So how do I perform against other boards? Where am I doing really well against benchmarks? And where am I not doing so well? And that immediately gives you some context and also draws your eye to an action plan. So what are the issues that we think are really important as a board where we're not doing as well as we would like to be? And therefore, these are the things. We don't try and, boil the ocean. We don't try and tackle every single thing. We focus on those top priorities that drawn out of this, that's a data-led objective analysis. And this is what we focus on. So it gives you some really crunchy, manageable things that you can action as a result. So that's what we were trying to achieve with BoardClic, and we work now with a whole range of different organizations, so hundreds and hundreds of different organizations of all ownership types around the world. So I think the concept is proving valuable for lots of different organizations.
Thank you, Sarah. And Kate, maybe you've been the closest to BoardClic within BGF, and you obviously saw the value of it as a tool. Do some of the things resonate in terms of like the time commitment, the cost commitment, the data-driven approach?
Absolutely. So if I think about the board effectiveness reviews I would do when I was a headhunter, which is too many years ago than I would like to say, or in my previous role with a large mid-cap firm, we didn't have access to a platform. So if we decided to conduct an informal review ourselves, you are in the world of spreadsheets, emails, Word documents, lengthy PDFs, lots of presentation, quite a lot of gut feel, which there is merit in gut feel because we're dealing with people, but it's nowhere near as good as informed gut to interpret actual data. It also was deeply personal because you're being interviewed by someone, so it's not quite as safe necessarily as filling in your anonymous survey, particularly for leaders who weren't perhaps the CEO or chair, leaders who might be new to the board, a bit nervous. So that's kind of context that was the problem that BoardClic was trying to solve. And I heard of BoardClic from a peer private equity investor who said, you won't believe it, Kate, you won't have to be doing these spreadsheets anymore. Look, put it in an app. And so I was very excited by that. But, I've grown up in private equity, so naturally suspicious. Okay, well, it sounds like a good app. Let's beat it up. Let's test it. Let's try all sorts of different things. And everything Sarah says from our evidence it rings true. One of the things I like about it actually is it manages to make a hugely complex set of data and questions feel actually really quite clear and simple. And you can get on the app and do it quite quickly. And then as the person who interprets the report, so I've been client and user and interpreter of one of these reports, it makes it much clearer, much more quickly where the areas to have a really valuable discussion are. So you can much more quickly cut through, do you know what, let's celebrate these things because these are really great. And let's do that because that's important.
Yeah.
Great. And then here are some areas where we can make improvements. Often these aren't, black and white, you must change everything. This is about incremental improvement. This area is good, but if you adopted X practice that we learned from this other board and had a talk about that, you could be 10-20% more efficient. And the other really important thing for me is the regularity. Because it's easy and it's quick and it's cost effective, you can do this much more regularly. I used to think about board effectiveness reviews happening once every 3 years. If you think about the pace of change in BGF portfolio companies, it could be a completely different company in 3 years' time. So waiting for 3 years isn't particularly relevant. And so being able to map much more regularly way being, way of going, and how is it improving, and keep that conversation agile is really, really important. And being able to visualize that so you can see where you're improving. So yeah, I do think it's really, do I wish I'd come up with it? Yeah, probably. One of those very nice apps where you think, oh, I didn't think of that one.
That's really good to hear from you, Kate. Now, actually, we're going to be trying this out, obviously, within the portfolio, and even prior to this, in your experience, Kate, you've seen different types of boards. You've seen the boards that are well run, and there are boards that are not so well run. And I often see that if you're sitting on the other side, you're doing the work. In your mind, you're like, no, actually, we are quite effective because you don't really see the big picture, or you're not sitting in the external perspective, right? Could you, based on your 10 years of experience in this space, maybe share with us maybe some characteristics or the pillars of what is a well-run board versus a not so well-run board?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And your point about not knowing, and also to Sarah's point about not knowing where you benchmark, this is not like sports where you can see what position you're in and how your incremental improvements are making you better than benchmarks or competitors. You don't get access to that kind of data. So it is really helpful to get an external perspective. I mean, my views, broadly speaking, and we talk about this a lot within BGF, are, there are 4 kind of key elements for me about strong boards. I would say this because it is my bias, but it starts with people.
Yep.
It always starts with the people. Have we got a complementary balance of experience, of skills, and a balance of styles that complement each other and that are really relevant to the business's strategy? So if you're in super scale-up mode, we've probably got lots of people who are really high energy. Have we also got someone who's a bit more measured, who can keep a check on things as a balance? So that would be an example. And as I said earlier, regardless of style, all those people really passionate about what the business is trying to achieve. The other thing I would say is really clearly defined roles, with each member understanding their role in that board and what their role to add value is, and how they are doing that. So if you grabbed any board member and said, how are you adding value? They'll be able to answer you. So that on people. The next 3 I could put in any order, and I'm going to save probably the next most important one for last. So next we'll move to content. really efficient boards that are running well, high quality board packs, high quality management information that is relevant to future performance. So weighting of discussions towards future performance, a really balanced debate that uses all those perspectives that we talked about. And also, I think, particularly in growing companies, relevant market knowledge. One of the most valuable things a board can do for a very fast growing company is bring that external perspective, not necessarily always in the form of contacts or network, but just past experience, perspective, knowledge of other companies, knowledge of customers, so that the board can make sure their strategy is really agile and working most effectively within the market. So that on content. I guess next, process, and we have to talk about process. And lots of our creative entrepreneurs in particular kind of go, oh, board process. But actually, it is your friend, because clear, well-planned agendas with attributable actions, board packs coming out in good time so that everyone's read them. So your board is a really interesting discussion, not reading back through packs and asking questions that have been answered already. And I think the most important thing with process is decision-making protocols, so that you can go forward with attributable actions and track your progress. Really effective boards aren't having the same debate. Every board meeting, you can see a progression, it's moving forward. And of course, regular board effectiveness reviews. It's part of your process, obviously. That is my strong opinion. And I suppose the final piece, and Sarah will comment on this as well, I hope, is culture and alignment. So all of those things, people, content, and process, and then a board culture where it's really honest, it's open, there are strong relationships between each constituent that exist outside of the boardroom, so you can get this deep level of trust that people can bring the constructive challenge, and it is well understood that those challenges are in the best interest of the business. Mm-hmm. So those are the things that we really think about and that we're looking for when we assess boards.
Thank you, Kate. And Sarah, maybe hearing from you about people, content, process, and culture, which is a very interesting four-way dynamic.
Yeah, and we completely agree. And the way that we have structured our board effectiveness reviews are exactly around those key pillars that Kate has outlined. And I would just emphasize that I would also start with the people, because the other things are the structures that you put around the people to allow them to contribute the most that they possibly can, and to sort of unleash their potential and talent. But you have to have those right people around the table. One of the key things that the BoardClic platform does is to allows you to see alignment between individuals on themes, and then also on individual questions, which is fascinating, because you have boards that think they are very clear about what the priorities are, and everybody knows exactly, and everybody shares the same views, and then all of a sudden you start to ask this and you realize actually they don't quite. So that is really, really important to understand. Are we actually as aligned as we think we are? It also breeds a culture of transparency and feedback, which is really, really important if we're going to get better at things. And that desire to improve is another thing that I would say distinguishes a really, really top performing board. So do they actually want to constantly be looking for feedback and trying to get better and improve their performance as individual board members, but also as a team and as a unit? And to the point about the external board members trying to bring views from the outside, I think for when a company is relatively young still in its growth journey and they're getting used to the concept of a board, we often experience some sort of tension or lack of alignment between executive directors and the first non-executive directors, because naturally a non-executive director doesn't have the operational granular detail that an executive has, because they're not living in the business day to day. So working out what actually can we get, what is the real value we can unlock from this non-executive director, not expecting them to be another proxy executive. They're not, it's different. And I think this was really brought out to us during COVID, because nobody on any board has lived through a global pandemic.
Yep.
They haven't. We don't have any 120-year-old board members that I know of that saw the Spanish flu. So this is everybody's first. But nonetheless, there was huge learning and experience from other organizations that was being brought in by non-executive directors that without having those people on the boards, people just wouldn't be able to tap into with the same regularity, and just allowing the executives to have that ready-made pool of external knowledge and encouraging that to be shared was one of the huge values that we were discovering through the conversations we were having with boards over the last few years, which, 3 years ago, when you said, why are you appointing a non-executive director, nobody would have said to prepare us for a global pandemic. Jeez. But nonetheless, it was very valuable when it was there. Yeah. So with some unexpected as well as planned benefits from non-executive directors on boards.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. No, that's really interesting, because COVID, as you said, was a really challenging time for almost all businesses. And that's where the quality of the people and their trust amongst each other becomes very, very valuable. Maybe jumping into a real example, because I think on principle basis, we're all agreed that this is what you need to be doing and the 4 pillars we talked about. But could you maybe share any external example of a company who has gone through this process of collecting the evidence, sort of looking at this internal review all the way to creating some impact for their own functions and operations and financial performance at the end of the day?
Yes, absolutely. So if I sort of think about a couple of the real life companies that we've been working with over the let's just pick last sort of 6 months, just to keep it really relevant. So there's one organization that had done exactly what Kate was saying. They sort of did the external every 3 years board effectiveness review, and it sort of was picked up and put down every 3 years, but wasn't a really dynamic living tool for them. So what they did with us was they started the journey with BoardClic. They did their first BoardClic assessment, so they kind of get their line in the sand. But then what they wanted to do was to pick out the top 5 things that came out of it that they want to work on. So coming back to my point about you don't try and do everything after your first review, you pick the top things that are going to make a difference and move the dial for you. We, because of the way the platform works, we can do pulse follow-up surveys. So we designed a quick pulse survey on those 5 priorities that they could keep running through the year to check whether they thought they were improving, getting better. So they've now done about 5 or 6 months worth of that. So they did their initial review, then they do their pulse survey every month on, are we improving on those 5 issues, with their clear action plan. And then they're going to review the whole board again at the end of 12 months. And what they will do is they will be building up their own trends and data in the platform. And then next time they can pick, right, are these still the right 5? Are there a different 5? What are our priorities now? How are they changing? And the specific actions go from anything to, we need another non-executive that covers this particular issue and area, or actually the board doesn't have enough visibility of the management team's thinking on this particular issue. We're going to have a dinner, whereas a board, we're just going to have, it's not decision-making item, this is discursive. We just want to lift up the bonnet a little bit and just bring the non-execs closer and show them how we're thinking about these issues and the work that we're actually doing, so they understand what it's like for the exec team and what the exec team is worrying about and thinking about, to enable those non-executives to make a more valuable contribution at the board meetings. So those are some of the things that came out of this particular board review. But one of the things that Kate and I and the team have been talking about is how we build a BGF set of benchmarks and data for you, which I think is something that we're all very excited about. And as we are now building up more and more and more BGF companies in the platform, rather than benchmarking against the external the wide world externally, we will actually be able to create BGF own benchmarks.
Okay.
So you'll be able to see how you're doing against other BGF companies and then pick priorities, topics, themes. Roshni, we're working with you. We're doing some work around ESG and how we can be building and to give some people some real data and things that will be hopefully even more pertinent and relevant for BGF companies over the course of 12 months. So those are some of the real life things that we're working on with organizations at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that BGF benchmark is really interesting. And one of the reasons it will work in the BGF portfolio where perhaps it doesn't for others is the sheer scale.
Yes.
You need that kind of critical mass for a benchmark data set to be really interesting. So you can't do it on an investment portfolio of 12 or 15 companies. You need over 100. And I think that is really interesting because that is our opportunity to reflect back across the peer-to-peer network of CEOs and boards how people are doing, bring in ideas, really share innovation around boards across the whole portfolio. And that's super exciting for us to be able to do. We've still got those external benchmarks. We can still look at external, we can look at BGF. And then I think boards also using those and thinking about their own experience and bringing that into their own context. And that's the balance for me is where this has been really interesting. These board effectiveness reviews don't deliver the answers to the strategic questions. It's not about coming out of this with a new strategy. It's about ensuring that the board is asking themselves the right questions and making sure that constituent parts are all working. So it could be that you need a new set of experience. It could be that you're underutilizing a really valuable set of experience that's in the board or placing too much emphasis on something specific. So I think having that benchmark is going to be really interesting, and everyone who's on this webinar and much more broadly in the portfolio will be contributing to that and building something really valuable, which hasn't been available to medium-sized scaling up companies before.
No. Yeah. And it's and on that point about benchmarking as well, it's not about getting a score that says, oh, we've passed or we haven't passed and then, move on. It's about relative performance and improvements over time. And it can be quite reassuring. So one of the areas that comes up as an issue in almost every single board evaluation we ever do is succession planning for the executives. It's an issue for every single board. So if you look at anybody's results in isolation on succession planning, they might think, oh, we're doing terribly. This is absolutely awful. And then we show them the benchmark. We say, there you go. See, don't you feel a bit better now? It isn't you. This is a very difficult issue. But to Kate's point, here are some examples. Here are some things that other boards are doing. And here are some conversations you might want to start having and just ways of thinking about it to try to help you, give you the tools. If all of this stuff was easy and was very easily solvable and everybody knew exactly what to do, we wouldn't need to be doing any of this. The whole point is that these are very, very complex issues that people are trying to grapple with and prioritize. And this is just a way of helping you think through some of that and giving you a framework around it.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Kate, thinking about the BGF portfolio, I think there's been different levels of success and failures and learnings that we've had within our own sort of journey. And even before BoardClic, I know that your team in particular has been doing this in quite a lot of different ways. Could you maybe share an example of how you've seen maybe a BGF company or another company that you thought did this really well and innovatively on their own, and what was sort of the driving factor behind their success?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I was thinking of examples, and actually this example probably predates BoardClic's formation, but I pick it because I think it's a really interesting one about succession, to Sarah's point. So we had a board in the portfolio. I really love this board. The people just so passionate about what they were doing. Great business, great product. The board wasn't quite clicking together. We'd been in for about a year. Excuse the pun. I didn't even mean to do that. There you go. So they'd been together for about a year, maybe, with co-CEOs, 2 co-founders who'd become co-CEOs, a chair who'd been with them for a long time, who was incredibly loyal to the business and added huge amount of value through the startup phase. Probably wouldn't have got to the scale-up phase without that chair.
Okay.
He was very close to the management team, an independent non-executive director who joined on BGF's investment, who was incredibly well known in the industry. Quite busy though, very, very well known. So an executive role plus a couple of other roles, so not huge amounts of time. And the co-CEOs split up the executive functions between them, so you didn't have a specific CFO or a specific COO. It was sort of split between them. And they came to a point where, and a BGF director, and sort of came to a point where they were saying this is not particularly sustainable to have every function reporting into co-CEOs. There's not clarity for the people in the business. That was starting to have an impact on customer decisions and delivery, sitting in different places. And the frustration from the management team, they didn't quite feel they were getting the value that they had expected from the independent director. So we wanted to examine sort of why that was, because ultimately what you had was 5 really excellent people.
Yeah.
Really excellent individuals. Why was it not gelling? And we went quite simple in terms of tools. We had a set of questions for the individuals to reflect upon themselves and their own role. We had a set of questions. We had 10 questions about the board in general, and then 10 questions about what they wanted it to look like, what they wanted to achieve. And we had conversations, but we had individual conversations so that each person could feel like they could just speak their mind.
Yeah.
And it was quite a leap of faith, because I actually did this exercise with them. It was a real leap of faith, management to trust me as a BGF employee. And they did. And everything to this day, their individual answers are completely confidential and shall never be revealed. But what it showed us is actually there were a couple of issues. One, the chair who they'd had in place was too close to the co-founders to really effectively challenge them. And they all thought in the same way because they'd been together for a long time.
Yeah.
So the independent director felt quite frustrated that a lot of decisions had been made by the time they came to the board meeting, and it was more of a presentation. But equally, he didn't have a huge amount of time to get into that with them.
Yeah.
And then the other thing it highlighted was that co-CEOs wasn't really working, especially for new people joining the business, who does what. And so the upshot was a really frank conversation between the co-CEOs about what they really wanted to do. One of them becoming CEO, one of them becoming COO, a former chair, them swapping effectively so that the former chair remained on the board as an NED because institutional memory was incredibly important, and he remained as a mentor to the CEO. And then interestingly, that opened up space for a chair, and the independent Ned who had in there quite rightly said, I don't have time to chair this. And we went back and used the board effectiveness review to really hone the brief for a chair. So we did a very tailored search to find a new chair. And interestingly, the skills that came into the board off the back of that were quite different than what the management team had first assumed that they needed. So they've gone big on industry knowledge and contacts and cred, which can be really valuable. But actually the gap for them was digital transformation. We hadn't been through that before. So they needed a chair who understood how to drive innovation and digital change in the context of their industry. And that's what we really looked for. And then bringing those elements together, it was so useful for the incoming chair to have the context of the board effectiveness review to understand what might be sensitive, what conversations had already been had. And just generally the whole exercise created the ability for everyone to speak openly. We've been through this now, we've done it, we know it's not that painful. Actually, it's created really useful conversations, it's created change. So that was a really interesting example for me, and it allowed the business to hire more effectively. Business grew. It's actually a successful exit now. And I think that also is really important, that the business wanted to position itself for exit, they needed to be very clear to any future investor or buyer who's running the business, how is it led? These are the people who are going to present the story. And so just going through that process, and the management team, we didn't suggest it to the we didn't suggest a board effectiveness review to the management team. They came to us because they could see it just wasn't quite the way they wanted it to be. So that was really interesting, and I suppose really cemented in our minds the value of this from an investment perspective. It goes straight to value on the exit. It certainly made the investor director a lot more comfortable. That he's now joining a board that was really, really well aligned. That's probably the example that it was one of the earlier ones, but it's the one that has always stuck in my mind.
Yeah. And it all started with asking the right questions. That's what it seemed like. If you don't even ask the right question, then how will you be able to try to fix it, right? That's the whole thing. And I think that's one of the key questions that is also coming through the audience is how do they go about it? So maybe if we take a minute to think through what are the top 3 or 4 questions that somebody from the board, the chair, or the non-exec who's listening to this conversation should go back and ask around the table. So what would be, from the two of you, those recommendations of here are a couple of questions, start with this. Maybe Kate, just staying with you, if you could share.
So I think starting with what are our goals individually, and if you get each individual, possibly not even to say, actually, just to write down in a couple of bullets, what are your top goals? And to Sarah's point, what are your top priorities? That is a really interesting question, because then if you compare them around the board, you can immediately see how well aligned you are in terms of priorities. So that's probably the first one for me, is not have we got the right strategy? You should ask that question and that will come. But before any of that, what are each individual's priorities and how do those compare across the set?
Interesting. And then Sarah, maybe from you, what are the top 3-4 questions that we could go through across the table?
Yeah, so I think just adding to that, I would start with the priorities as well. And then I would also say for each individual board member to ask themselves, what do I uniquely bring to this board? What am I trying to achieve and contribute around the table? Yeah. But then also to ask themselves, and again, I think Kate's advice, they don't necessarily have to publish this answer, but just ask themselves, do I feel able to make that contribution? Is the environment within which I'm operating around the board table optimal to allow me to make the contribution I want to make? And then it might be, yes, it largely is. It's rarely, yes, it's absolutely perfect. But it might be, yes, largely it is. Okay, so what other things do you think, what other areas would you like to see addressed to help you to make an even better contribution? Or it might be, actually, no, I really think the board is missing a lot of the value from me. Mm-hmm. So, okay, so what needs to change then to allow that? And so if you start to think about what are the priorities and am I able to contribute to best affect myself as an individual, then you really start to get into some of the fundamental points about how a board functions. And then you can go from there to build up a much fuller picture of how the board is operating. But you can also start to have a conversation around what might this journey look like for us? Mm-hmm. What would we want to do when? Because you might say you don't want to start having gone from absolutely nothing to the full board evaluation. You might want to do a slightly smaller one first. Mm-hmm. And some organizations have done it. They've done a pared back version, just while they start to have some of these conversations and get used to it. You might say, we'll do a slightly slimmer version first. And then in 6 months, we'll let that bed in. We'll have the conversations around that. You might want somebody to come in and help you to facilitate that conversation. Somebody from Kate's team, for example, or somebody else that you might want somebody to come in and just help you explore that. Then 6 months later, you do the next one. Then you start to build it up from there. You might want to do a deep dive into a management team review to add on to your board review. You might want to do feedback on individual directors. There's a number of ways you can take this, But yeah, I would start with your priorities and the individuals around the table and go from there. The other thing I did just want to say there, and Kate gave a really, really interesting example of that board that you worked with that really cemented for you how important this is. But people always ask the question, how do we ascribe a value to this really? Does this really make a difference to the bottom line? And you've got a clear example where for you, it really went straight through to the exit, the value of this. But we have been talking to Grant Thornton, who have, they map corporate governance trends year on year. And I thought, in case there are still any cynics in our audience, they actually in 2019 looked at the link between governance and value creation. And they found that companies that have strong governance are 29% more efficient at generating profits. They are 43% more efficient at making and selling products. And that leads to 3.4 times more free cash flow in the business. So they established once and for all a very strong link between good governance and value creation and growth, which is ultimately what this is all about.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for sharing that example. And we did receive a follow-on question on this from one of our attendees around, I think the question around starting from what is your goal, what are your priorities are really important. But then how do you sort of link it back to individual contributions, right? So the question that they're trying to ask over here is, how do you sort of understand whether somebody is actually driving value? One way is to ask them, as you said, Sarah, are you being able to use your skill set? But the other is an external perception also from others that do you think this person is able to create value or not? Is there a way to approach this question without it becoming a minefield in certain ways?
So the way that we think about this, so you're right, as soon as you get into individual board member feedback, it can get quite personal. So what we do at BoardClic as a starting point when we do the main board evaluation is you define the different roles on the board before people start completing the survey, and you can define them at as granular a level as you like. And obviously the more granular you define the roles, the more identifiable individuals are. But if you were just to define, for example, executive directors, non-executive directors, we usually define the chair because we have a specific section on feedback for the chair. So it's important to have the chair defined, but otherwise you could just do non-executives and executive directors. And then we ask questions around things like, do the non-executives feel that their skills and competencies are leveraged effectively by the executives? So you start to get a sense of, as a group, do these people feel like they are being used effectively rather than an individual? And then you also, the executives can comment on, do they feel like they get sufficient challenge and support from the non-executive? So the executives get to say as well, do they feel like they're getting the right input? And if you're starting to get hints in the data or any of the commentary around those questions, then it gives you areas that you might want to probe and dive into, but you don't immediately have to go into Director B does this, doesn't do that, all of those kinds of things, which can feel quite confrontational, particularly in the early stages of this work. We do have a specific product on the platform, which is individual board director feedback. So we can go there if a board really wants to do that. I wouldn't advise starting there. I think that is for a board that's further down the journey.
No, I think that's right. And I think the other thing is to approach a board effectiveness review in a very open way. So my advice would be, don't do a board effectiveness review if you think you've got an underperforming executive and it might flush it out. Feel like there's an underperforming executive or there's room for improvement. Set a performance review, and managing executive performance is related to this, obviously, but it is separate. I wouldn't, if you have a strong feeling already about, it could be non-executive or executive, start bringing that up with the chair or others as relevant, and think about performance reviews, and we can talk about that separate. We use a whole nother webinar on leadership performance. Board effectiveness reviews can give you a clue about that, and there will certainly be correlation, but I'd be careful not to mix up the two.
Okay, great. Another question that we've received is the frequency. So essentially understanding that, is there a combination of a lighter version and a deeper version of board effectiveness review, whether through BoardClic or independently, that companies should be thinking about as setting a timetable for themselves? And maybe, Kate, starting with you on this one, what do you think is a good, healthy timetable for board effectiveness reviews?
I think it depends where you are in terms of stage. I think, if you've got a company where the board is performing really well, you could probably get away with doing a review once every 2 years. In kind of larger world corporate governance listed companies, the requirement is once every 3 years. I think I've already said I think that's probably a bit too long for very fast growing companies. I think something once a year around an annual strategy day is my preference.
Okay.
If a company was asking for my advice, I'd say, once a year, probably in the run up to a strategy day, so you can use the output of your board effectiveness review for your strategy day. And then this idea of pulse surveys in between, I think that's particularly helpful for newly formed boards where the relationships are fresh and you're starting to get to know each other. It's particularly helpful where you've done things like made an acquisition. Perhaps you've got another constituent in the board. So just that ability to formally take a pulse survey so you know what's going on, but also just the act of doing that. So people lean into, we care about whether this board is effective. We want to make this group work. We are a team.
Yeah.
I think that's important, but a sort of formal, full review, I probably wouldn't do it more than annually unless there was a very specific concern that came out that you wanted to address and you wanted to do a follow-up maybe 6 months later to see if the actions you put in place were working.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. So I would liken it to the way that everybody does performance reviews of their teams within their organisation. So we know that you do a formal annual performance review, and you do that as good practice, and it's documented and it's there as a line in the sand every year. But we also know that it's not good to not say a single word of feedback between each annual review, that is not good practice and it doesn't lead to optimal performance. And it's exactly the same for boards. There seems to be this thing that once you get to a board, feedback and performance improvement stops. That's it. You've made it. You're done. You're the fully baked article. And we don't think the world is or should work like that. So I think that's right. You do your major review once a year, but in between that, you do pulse surveys. So you get into a pattern and an expectation of feedback and improvement. It just becomes the way you do it. And we can build specific pulse surveys on topics and themes. We also have a meeting express pulse survey, which can go out after every board meeting, just so people can give a quick bit of feedback. Was that an effective meeting? Did we cover the right topics? Did I feel like I was engaged? Was there an open culture in that meeting? And it just sets the expectation that we are a board that cares about our performance and we give each other constructive and helpful feedback on a regular basis.
Got it, Sarah. One question from me to you, Kate, is something that you said right at the beginning about celebrating the things that do go right and recognizing the impact. I think whenever we talk about board effectiveness in these pieces, it's all about things that have gone wrong and things that are not working well. Maybe just sharing, and maybe from both of you, like, what is the impact of actually celebrating the things that do go well? Does it really help towards building stronger bonds and trust?
It does. I think it really does. And particularly in fast-growing companies, you can often take for granted things that are going well. Good, that's done. Move on to the next thing. Worry about the next problem. Actually, just taking a moment to recognise we have something really valuable here, something that's working really well, and understanding what good looks like in the context of your own board is important, because it's like your North Star. This is good. We've done this really well. This is what we keep, and will keep us on the right path. And then here are the other things that can improve. And celebrating that is really important, and it trickles down through the organization. So if a board is celebrating its success and celebrating each other, that moves down through the whole organization. So it goes to the culture of the whole business and the culture of performance improvement and success celebration. So you'll attract better people, you will retain your people. I think it is incredibly valuable.
And to that point, we were delighted on Friday to celebrate an award for top performing chair to one of the BGF chairs, because when we looked back on our 2021 results from all of our reviews, one of your chairs was in our very, very, very top performing cohort. And we were able to give that feedback on Friday. And who doesn't want to have that kind of feedback? You know,
I don't know if he's, I'm not going to name him because he's actually a very humble person, but I might try and send an email. I'm going to check with him, see if we can send an email afterwards, and he'll probably go shy and say no. But it was fantastic to have that feedback. Rosie, it looks like we might be.
We are at the top of our hour, and then maybe if I could ask you to quickly give a 30-second call to action for all the people who are on this webinar, what would your call to action be?
I think it's really clear from me and from Sarah, board effectiveness, incredibly valuable and important. It's important to us. If you're already doing it, fantastic, keep doing it. If you want to talk to us about BoardClic, you can get in touch with me or Investor Director, or head over to our Portfolio Exchange app where there's information about BoardClic. And even if you're still thinking, I just want to know what that means for me, pick up the phone, let's have a conversation about it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Call us. There we go. That's the call to action.
Thank you both for a wonderful conversation, and thanks to all the attendees for engaging.